And now we move to about half an hour or so discussion on the forum discussion topic of when citation integrity is questioned. And I'd like to now hand over to the hosts of that discussion section, Gráinne McNamara, who's Research Integrity Publication Ethics Manager at Kaga Publishers and also a council member, and Elena Vicario, who's Director of Research Integrity at Frontiers and a COPE advisor.
Okay. Thank you all very much for coming, and thanks to Trevor for that introduction. Today, Elena and I are going to have what is quite a broad topic discussion about citation integrity, be it the inclusion of irrelevant citations, erroneous citations, or completely non-existent citations. What I will say is that we are going to have probably very few answers for you today and an awful lot of questions. But with that spirit in mind, I'm hoping that we can keep the discussion very broad. We want to hear your experiences with this topic, new trends that you've seen. So please do put your questions into the Q&A box. And we'll come to you after about a 10-minute introduction to the topic from Elena and I. And we will, if you're comfortable, ask you to unmute so you can put your hand up and we'll call on you and ask you to unmute and share your experiences. For those of you watching this recording later, please do follow this QR code to the COPE website topic discussion for this, where you can input your experiences and share them with us. So please do take part, participate, because this is definitely an evolving topic. So when Elena and I sat down to talk about what we wanted to cover here today, we used a really broad term of citation integrity quite deliberately, because for as long as there have been references, there have been, concerns about citation integrity, and that might be simply bias in citations, geographic, school of thought, status quo that have an influence on the citation integrity, to more deliberate or manipulative efforts. So citations are under the spotlight increasingly due to incentive structures, and there's increased in scrutiny on practices that aim to artificially influence the citation rate of a journal or an individual, as is evidenced by the existing COPE documentation, discussion documents, positions related to questions of citation integrity. We've all heard of terms like citation cartel. We've seen that paper mills are interested in selling citations. In the peer review process, we've seen evidence of coercive citation. So the topic of citation integrity is very broad and complicated. Layering on top of that is the fact that mistakes, human and machine introduced, have always existed. But what is different today as opposed to 15 years ago is that new technologies are muddying the water between what is clearly visible as an honest error and what is more clearly visible as misuse of tools or citation metrics. And the scale of potential questions about citation integrity was recently highlighted in this article in The Lancet that you've probably seen. Topic we're going to touch on today related to what is different in 2026 is that we know that generative AI tools are being used routinely by authors in manuscript preparation and by journals or publishing partners to automate, during the production processes, to automate routine tasks, including those related to references. And this is positive for everybody involved when things go well. With a correct output and human oversight, we can reduce the amount of time that's spent on automatable tasks. But the limitations of reliance on tools without oversight is clear when things go wrong. And the consequences for this can be quite serious for the scholarly record. We've seen articles being retracted following on from concerns about citation integrity. So we're talking about quite a broad range of severity under the topic of citation integrity. So we've all seen examples of how questionable citations present in submissions or publications, be it firsthand or maybe secondhand from reading articles online. But the question for today is really, what steps can an editor take when they're confronted with a question related to citation integrity? And to frame that discussion, we wanted to utilize some fictionalized real examples of scenarios and investigations informed by our experiences, both working in research integrity teams at publishing houses. All of these are based on our experiences, but none are a description of a specific case. So in each presentation, we'll demonstrate a scenario that you might have come across, and give examples about how the context can change an initial interpretation. So through this, we'll point out some of the unique features of investigating citation integrity, and also what is making these investigations particularly challenging, even more so now. So kicking off, I want you to imagine you are an editor, maybe you are an editor, so that's a very easy position to imagine yourself in. And you have a concern about a published article. Maybe it came to you by a reader, or you came across yourself, where you notice that all the reference details are correct, except in three instances where the DOIs either don't exist or they exist and they point to a different article. Now, this seems like it could be a relatively straightforward, explicable scenario. But what I want to talk through today is how the same picture can have very different context and explanations, which then can have very different outcomes, and what the response would be, therefore. So let's imagine you have this article, and you see that three of the DOIs don't exist, and you ask the authors to comment on this, and they respond to you and say, yes, they used a generative AI tool to suggest references as part of their manuscript preparation, and the references exist, but that's how they included wrong DOIs. Now, on the face of it, this could potentially be an acceptable use of generative AI, but as an editor, you have questions that you need to ask yourself if in such a context, because this has implications for the depth of any literature review. As we know, generative AI tools have biases in their training data set, in their algorithms, and a lot of these are undisclosed. So how have the authors addressed these undisclosed biases? How can they answer that? Using generative AI to suggest references is a meaningful use of generative AI. And so have the authors declared this in the publication? And did you have a policy to expect them to declare it? If you did have a policy, and whether or not they declared it, could this be just a tip of the iceberg, and perhaps they used generative AI for other reasons that they also haven't declared? So it's important to consider the knock-on implications of what the authors have said here. Another scenario you might come across when you see DOIs that don't resolve is you look closer at the references and you see that they are in Chinese language sources or other non-English journals. So for non-globally indexed sources, a DOI that doesn't resolve outside its home database isn't necessarily indicative of a fabricated DOI. So if you see something like a scenario like this and the DOI doesn't resolve, you can consider searching the database directly or reaching out to the author and getting a copy of the resource itself. So in such a scenario, that you have questions to ask yourself as an editor. So do you have a policy for verifying sources you can't easily access, whether they are in a different language or they're historic sources that are only available at the primary location? And so how as an editor, do you verify a source that you can't access, and whether that's a reference or data that you can't access, and how do you handle that cross submissions? And does your journal have a policy for non-globally indexed references? How are reviewers or readers supposed to interpret the discussion of the literature review in this context? Another context or fact that could come up in an investigation is you see that the errors were actually introduced during typesetting by the publisher. Remember what I said earlier, that we detect these issues using some of the similar automated tools that authors are using to generate them. And we, as publishers or journals or editors, are often using the same technology in the production systems as authors use pre-submission. So if an error is possible for an author to be introduced, it can be possible for the production process to introduce it, and there are responsibilities for making sure that no errors are introduced that way. So if the error is introduced during typesetting, the responsibility really shifts from the author to the publisher. And there's questions as an editor we would need to be asking of how do you establish at what stage the incorrect DOIs were introduced, and how do you change the processes to make sure this doesn't happen again? And once you have resolved that, how can you correct the scholarly record appropriately so that citation metrics are going to the correct reference overall? So this is a complicated topic. And the same presentation can have lots of different explanations, and I'm sure that some of these topics are raising questions for you. So Elena is going to take you through some more common examples that we're seeing day to day now.
Thanks, Gráinne. So in this case, you are handling a submission as an editor, and all the references seem to be real. They're verified. There's no issues with the DOIs. Everything checks out. But there are 3 references that seem irrelevant to the context and the topic of the manuscript. So not every citation integrity issue is related to potentially hallucinated references or mismatched Frankenstein citations. We know that paper mills also sell citations to researchers, and this can manifest as seemingly irrelevant citations in an article, where you have a dermatology reference in a built environmental manuscript. And then again, this can also be introduced due to AI, if AI is being used in writing or polishing a manuscript for submission, or it can be also a deliberate attempt by a fraudulent actor. So in this case, this example shows that it's not enough to check that you have verified references at submission. You also need to know whether they fit the context of the manuscript, as this might also be an integrity concern. We said before that errors are not new, and even without AI, before authors also did make mistakes in adding references that were irrelevant. So let's look at this case a bit more closely. So you have 3 references in this case. It could be like a minor issue if they're partially irrelevant, and we can look into whether these are in the introduction or discussion. So let's look at the first context scenario here. What happens if these 3 relevant references that you're seeing are part of a submission that is a systematic review, and the incorrect references are part of the meta-analysis? As an editor, do you then consider whether the whole meta-analysis might be flawed? What steps might be needed to resolve these concerns? You might need to have a lot more scrutiny into how the systematic review and the meta-analysis was performed, how much these 3 references actually came to play at the conclusions that the authors are making. So, this could be some extra questions that you need to ask here beyond the relevant references. Second scenario, in this case, we have these 3 relevant references, but they are part of a reference list of 6 references, so it's half of these references are irrelevant. And in this case, a submission, this article type is a letter. So we have also seen a rise in letter submissions recently, again, speculated to be accelerated by Gen AI used by authors. So in this case, as an editor, the fact that half of the references here are irrelevant, does this make you question again whether the entire letter is flawed completely, or is a superficial letter? Is this again something that you want to look into it more closely at how it was conceived and how it was written, and what is the evidence here that the authors had really the expertise to write this? Another different scenario that we can also encounter is that in this case, you start investigating and these references were added by a suggestion of a reviewer during peer review. So in this case, you might need to turn into thinking at potential citation cartels, where's the citation? The authors may believe that adding them was a condition of acceptance by the reviewer, and that might turn this seemingly reference issue into a potential peer review manipulation investigation, especially if this reviewer or the citation beneficiary in this case have also been involved in the journal before, have reviewed before, have also suggested references or citations in the past. So in this case, you might need to refer to the systematic manipulation flowchart and citation cartel documentation from COPE, and these 3 references might be pointing towards a different type of issue to investigate further. Let's look at another example. In this case, you have a concern on a published article where, again, we're talking about 3 references, but these you cannot find anything to pull out from. So there's nothing on the web, nothing on all the databases. They seem to be fake titles, fake authors, fake DOIs. So unlike a broken DOI, like Gráinne was mentioning before, or an irrelevant reference, a wholly invented source can signal that parts of the argument were never grounded in real evidence, and something more problematic coming in terms of the deliberate attempt to create these invented references. And again, this becomes a little more complicated if we're talking post-publication, because you will need to investigate how much the article relies on these completely invented references to find whether it's appropriate to correct, put an expression of concern, or whether it undermines the entire confidence that you have in the article, and then a retraction is the best editorial action. But again, you look at the context and you might need to consider different things. So on the first scenario, the author says that they use GenAI to format the references into the journal style, and then it was the GenAI that replaced the references. So a formatting step normally shouldn't invent authors and titles altogether. We've seen AI create these mismatched references where some of it are real and some of it you can trace and some you can't. If the author says that GenAI was used to format the references into the journal style, you need to look at how credible that is as an explanation. Do you have access to the author's original time-stamped drafts where you can see the original references, and then can you trace that back into that explanation? Does it even matter, the fact that they used AI and they then declare it and they didn't verify the final reference list? Does it already point to something that could undermine the entire conclusions of the article and the confidence that you have in it? Second scenario, in this case, authors say, well, we asked GenAI to suggest references and it hallucinated some of the references. Again, in this case, using AI to suggest references and not verifying them is still a failure of due diligence by the authors. It could also go against the journal policies on AI use, where you always need a human to verify the AI output. And also, depending on what those references were meant to support, it might undermine the confidence of the article as a whole. So again, 2 similar scenarios using AI, but different explanations. It might also, looking back at the source, change what you act and how you act on them. Third one, in this case, you are looking at these references and you have either identified in the author's previous manuscripts or articles similar references to fake articles, or you've seen these very similar fake references in other papers at your journals, where you start to think of something more than just this article or these references, and it might be suggesting more paper mill activity or more systematic manipulation, where maybe these fake references are added by the paper mill companies and are just one of their fingerprints. So again, this might also change how you act on this as an editor, as your investigation might need to cover more articles and more than just this one paper. See you on the next slide, please, Gráinne. So, the examples that we gave you and the different scenarios within each of the examples, we've also tried to plot them alongside the spectrum from potentially more error, honest mistakes, all the way to likely deliberate and more serious issues. So you have on the lower end of the spectrum, the format and metadata errors. So you have a correct reference and either the DOI is missing or it's wrong after the formatting. Then we have this Frankenstein match where automation, which can be a reference manager tool or a GenAI tool, matched an incomplete reference or a mistaken reference to the wrong paper. So then you have half and half references, you have some part of the references which is real and you can trace it back, but then the DOI points to another paper, for instance. Then you have non-discoverable DOI. So there's no DOI to find it. Gráinne pointed to an example of a potential non-English database or non-indexed journals, but again, it makes verification of this reference in the context of a peer review process a little bit complicated. Then we go into irrelevant citations. So the source exists, the reference seems fine, but it doesn't support specific claim or is completely irrelevant to the content of the manuscript. So why was that reference introduced? And then finally, all the way to the cited work does not exist and it cannot be found anywhere. So this is the fabricated reference altogether. And through the examples, hopefully you've also been able to, although we don't have the answers, as Gráinne said, on what is the best action for each of the scenarios, that there's different sort of steps that you can take. So one thing is, what you see. So what is that you're faced either at submission or publication in terms of references. It could be erroneous, non-verifiable references, non-existent, irrelevant references. But it's important to also see where it came from. So was this an author mistake? And can you corroborate that, with some of the investigation? Was it an AI suggestion? And if so, was AI declared or not? Was it a reviewer addition? So that points to a different type of issues. Was it a typesetting error? So something that the publisher introduced itself. So also knowing, what you see, where it came from, will help you as an editor make a decision. What does that mean? Does it mean that you can have certainty that it was an honest error by the authors or by the publisher, and there's a way to mitigate that with a correction? Does it point to deliberate misconduct in terms of going against policies of AIUs and declared AIUs, or even like more systematic manipulation, citation manipulation, etc.? And more importantly, in terms of the editorial action that you're going to take on that article, does it affect the conclusions of the article, or does it affect your confidence in that particular piece? Because that would also signal what is the best route in terms of correction, rejection, retraction for the journal. So with that, if you go on the next slide, we are going to circle back to the original questions in the first slide and open up for anyone in the audience. We have a few questions here, and we'd like to hear how you think should an editor assess questionable references across the spectrum. What we said, from honest errors to more serious integrity concerns that might undermine the entirety of the work. In what circumstances these seemingly relevant, mismatched, or non-verifiable references point to something more concerning, and what patterns of these reference concerns should lead to correction, clarification, or a more escalated response.